Well, again, if you didn't catch it earlier, I am Pastor Eric. It's a blessing to be with you. We're reading the Bible in a year as the church this year, and this is week 3. Now, if you started off really good with us, you start like most people. Reading the Bible is an amazing task, and we're going to preach through it in 52 weeks. There's 66 books. The math doesn't add up, but we'll make it happen. Don't worry. But this week is the killer of weeks in my eyes. Why? Because when you get going, you read Genesis, and it's the origin story, right? It's the beginning narrative, and a lot of us love origin stories, right? Whenever somebody like Marvel or Sony or somebody comes out with an action hero or something like that, one of the first things they do after the success of the first film is make the origin stories. Why? Because we care about where things come from. We talk about our origin because we care about where God brought us from. We weren't there for the garden. We weren't there for the Tower of Babel. We weren't there for Noah's Ark. But we care about what it says about our relationship with God because origin stories frame those things for us well. Then we read the book of Exodus. Exodus is so great that tons of people have made movies about the book of Exodus. Tons of people have rewrote that story in different veins and narratives and called it their own. Different people have engaged it throughout the eons. It is the most captivating and compelling work for the identity of the Hebrew and Jewish people around the world to this very day. Exodus is powerful. And if you read those first 2 books, congratulations, great job. You're feeling good about yourself. And then you hit the wall that is Leviticus, the Levitical wall, right? I don't know about you, but the first time I tried to read through the Bible straight through, I got to Leviticus, I'm like, I'm done. Right? Because it's hard, it's got depth, it's got meaning, it's got so much buried into it. And so we're going to wrestle with that this week. I'm going to read one verse, I'm going to give an outline, and then I'm going to break into what you understand as normal sermon stuff. All right? So the one verse I want you to keep in your hearts as we're talking this morning is from an area that I'm not going to sit the heaviest on, but I think the area that we need to feel the most when we go through this book as people. The book of Leviticus, chapter 20, verse 26 says this: "You must be holy to me, because I am the Lord am holy, and I have separated you from all other peoples to be my own." Friends, this is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. All right, real quick breakdown of Leviticus, if you would indulge me for just a moment. The author of Leviticus is assumed to be Moses, and he wrote this like the rest of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. The date that's ascribed to it, if you look classically at it, it's assumed that if Moses is writing this, it's probably near the end of Moses' life. Now, in the writing of this, we also believe that the scholars who have read the Bible over and over throughout the centuries and eons, we understand that the Old Testament authors continue to tweak and work with our text. Our texts show evidence of people massaging it throughout history, and the way in which we would understand the book of Leviticus probably didn't finish its primary edits and primary textual work until somewhere between 332 and 538 BCE. That's a big range, but it's a big book. The audience of Leviticus, if you didn't catch it, it's the Levites. Leviticus, Levites. It comes from the Greek, the title that we use from the Septuagint, which is a Greek Old Testament that we have. The Levites were the priestly class of people. They were the first people that this book was really intended for. And this book was also intended after the Levites, after the priests, to be understood by all the rest of the people, because what they were trying to do is understand how to have right lives in the eyes of God. This book was about having proper living relationship with God as people who were left in the wilderness to establish a nation and to understand who they were becoming, not just who they were. And so Moses would have intended this book to show not just the current people, but future religious generations a guide on how to be God's people, how to be holy, how to be pure, and how to be made right. Got it? All right. There's a few sections. The first section is approaching holiness, then it's becoming holy, and then it's delving deeper. Like if you broke the book in half, it's kind of getting ready to get near holiness through chapter 10. Beyond chapter 10, it's about becoming holy as a people. And you could break it down into sacrificial laws, the first 7 books. That's the killer, right? You start with sacrificial laws in the first 7 books. And then you've got inaugurating the priesthood to govern the people. And then you've got law and ceremonial purification, and really it's about the priests and the people getting everything right, all the feasts and the customs. And then the laws governing people's holiness, right? So we're going to talk about the distinction between those two this week. And then lastly, there's some supplemental stuff on the sanctuary and religious vows and stuff like that. You have law, offering, atonement, holy, sacrifice. Those are key things you're looking for. Okay. Now, we're in Leviticus, so I got to do something to get us started. So Leviticus talks a lot in the first 7 chapters about making sacrifices. So I've got a little help. Come on. I hope you're all ready for this. All right. We got to make a sacrifice this morning. No. I don't want to be fired. Now, when you see that, when you experience that moment, when the sheep gets thrown up to me, right? For some people, they're like, don't do it. I've got children watching. They're going to cry. Other people are like, a bridge too far, Pastor, a bridge too far. Sacrifices start the beginning of this book. Sacrifices start the beginning of this book. And the beginning of this book has got a powerful representation in it about us connecting what we are doing and what we have done, either one, to the cost of it. So when you read the first 7 books, you often hear about, or 7 chapters, you hear about ear and foot and hand and all these different offerings and how you're to make them and where you're to cut and where you're to place things. And there's symbolism there. I want to start by letting you know that. So if you read this book and you got ready for this week and you're really confused, there's symbolism buried in this book. This book is the essence of why when I preach, I often tell people that you have to look for the thing behind the thing. The thing behind the thing. Or you'll hear my other statement that there is simplicity that leads to complexity, and then it leads back to simplicity. This book is why I say those things. It's also a book I am absolutely in love with as a pastor. I am in love with this book. I've preached over 9 hours of unique content on this book, just myself in my life. So we're not going to do that this morning because people will want to go home, like lunch will be needed. But we're going to spend some time trying to understand one of the most complex books in the Bible. Now, to start with it, let's go to the very beginning. Like the title. The book Leviticus, like I said, comes from a Greek word that speaks about for the Levites. So when we read that book, we're starting with a Greek title in English. But if you're to speak to a rabbi or you speak to somebody who grew up in the Hebrew tradition and began with the Hebrew version of this, they would use a word called Vayikra. Now, it sounds funny. It might sound like Valkyrie or something like that, but Vayikra is the word. And when they say Vayikra, that first line is about calling. It's a word that's taken literally from the first sentence of this book, and God called once again to Moses is a good way to translate this. So if you have a book that says, and God called once again to Moses, it assumes that you understand that God called Moses once before. And so it assumes that you read the book before. The book of Leviticus assumes that you read Exodus, which assumes that you read Genesis. And you understand everything that's going on. So if you're a good Hebrew person and you're reading Leviticus, you need to have some depth in you to understand a little bit of what's going on in this book. You also need to understand Hebrew and Jewish tradition and custom and culture. And by that, what I want you to know is when you read this, you got to look for patterns in it. Now, I'm not normally like a pattern guy or a pneumologist who looks at numbers in the Bible, but in Leviticus, there are times in which things are repeated 7 times. Often, things are repeated in Leviticus 7 times. And they are the things that have value. They are the things that have weight. If you're somebody who grew up in the Jewish tradition, they would be red flags for you, telling you to pay attention here. Then there's also things that are repeated an 8th time. And when you repeat something for an 8th time, it is the beginning of a new week. The importance of that is that God is then doing something new. That God is taking that next step. That what was done on the day of 7 is in completion. Day 8 is a new creation narrative. And so in Leviticus, you have to pay attention to what things were done 7 times and why that's important, and why things are done 8 times, because there's things in Leviticus that are done 8 times that want to scream out to you that you will not be the same as what you once were. If there is ever a book outside of the New Testament that screamed out to people, this one should be it, because it's screaming out to a people who are in the wilderness, who were in exile, who were where they didn't belong, who are learning to be something new that they aren't anymore, but don't know yet how to be different. And so all of the sacrifices in the first 7 chapters, whether it's something that talks about the ear, it talks about what you're hearing. If it talks about the hand, it talks about what you're making. If it talks about the foot, it talks about where you're going. If it's talking about an animal sacrifice, it's talking about something that has significance and value and weight. They didn't have currency like we have. And so their animals not only were animals, but they were their exacting wealth and their legacy going forward into the future. People in this reading would have understood a depth to it that you and I simply miss. And so what I want to give you a caveat warning for, and I've spent almost 10 minutes trying to get across, is that even in the first few chapters, we can't go into the depth of what is going on without an intimate relationship with this book. This book is truly powerful. Now, I hope you read the first 7 chapters and you understand the sacrifices, and if you get confused, give me a ring sometime. I'd love to talk you through at some point, or at least give you a good resource for it. I want to move forward a little bit, because I want to move forward to chapters 8 through 10 for a few moments, because they're going to give us the setup that we need to understand what happens later in the book. When you move forward to chapters 8 through 10, 8 and 9 are setting up 10. Again, often in Leviticus, you have to see what's going on here to understand what's about to happen next. Just like many of us in our lives, you often have to look backwards to understand something that happened to you or happened to our society, that happened to our world, a change that happened that disrupted things, that gives us our present moment, and also what that present moment will do to our future. Leviticus is doing that to us over and over again. In chapters 8 through 10, what we see in this is that we're learning about how to have the ability to be in the divine presence of God. What we learn is that sacrifices teach us a few things that most of us likely missed. If there's a bodily association, like I said, there's a connection to it. Most of us in these sacrifice culture pieces need to understand how we relate to what we're doing. We need a physicality. Now, if you think that this is an old practice, listen to your own language for a moment. If you think this book of Leviticus takes things too far, how many people would say that that just killed me? Right? You talk about how something is so powerful that the anguish in it is like it killed you. You understand death sacrifice at some deep innate level. We had a humorous conversation before this service started about a 4-year-old who was talking about their playthings and making a sacrifice out of one of them. Maybe counseling should be involved, but maybe it's just kids understanding that things happen. My children have a depth of knowing that in ways that I never prepared them for. And I say that because I think for us as adults, I think our culture and our society, we don't understand Leviticus because when we go to the grocery store, our meat is so packaged that it doesn't have any blood in it anymore. We've lost that connection. We've desensitized ourselves. But here in the book of Leviticus, they are sensitizing you and reconnecting what you do to some other physicality or to some extreme connection. In our modern understanding, instead of making animal sacrifice or coming to the altar and understanding the blood and the smoke and the burning of the fat and all these other things, we try to do it in other modes. How many of you this morning, especially for those of you who are at home, when you were watching this, caught yourselves singing at the top of your lungs in your living room or bedroom or wherever you were watching this? If you're driving your car and you were listening to this through your radio, hopefully not watching the screen, and you were singing along with the music, how many people realized that the neighboring car thought you looked crazy? But it was the emotional connection to it that was driving you, that was powerfully transcending the moment. We lean onto what we can understand. They understood that of the few things they had in the wilderness, animals were one of them. And so God provided a venue and a manner and a way for them to relate to God. Now, in chapters 8 and 9, what we experience in there is Moses, once again, getting things ready for the people to get a priesthood. In 8 and 9, what he's doing is he's beginning to lay out what it's going to take. He's preparing for chapter 10. He's going to bring people to the tent of meeting. The tent of meeting is the space in which they are most closely connected to the divine, to where God is. It is the holiest space that they have. And in the tent of meeting, Moses is getting ready to transcend the moment in which Moses was the only intermediary between God and the people into a priesthood of people. And so what he does is he gets ready for Aaron and Aaron's sons to be brought in. Now, in this moment, you have this fascinating thing where you hear stories about robes and beards and oil. Right? It's an awkward couple of chapters, and there's like overflowing oil through Aaron's beard, and it's kind of awkward feeling. But again, it's culture and ritual and tradition that the people there could see, physically relate to, and understand. And in this moment, what they're doing is they're proclaiming that there will be a priesthood that helps you understand the will and the way of God. But if you stopped there, you didn't go far enough. I'm wearing my collar this morning as a callback to the priesthood notion of what this is. Now, why do we have a priesthood? Why? In other ancient Near Eastern cultures and ancient religions, oftentimes the priesthood was there to create the order and to keep the order. Now, that happened in the Jewish tradition. But if we go backwards and we understand Exodus, and when we reread Exodus, we remember that when God remembered his people and he brought them out of Egypt, out of the slavery of the land of Egypt, he was going to do what? He was going to make a priesthood of all of his people. All of his people. But here, Moses is about to bring Aaron and Aaron's sons, and we're about to get the Levitical tribe that gives us the title of this book, Leviticus. For our people to be a priesthood, they have to have a priest to emulate. For a people to be holy, they have to see somebody who's holy. For us to understand the sacrifice that Jesus would be, we have to have made sacrifice and understood it. The book of Leviticus is bridging things that we don't understand and giving us a tactile and tangible example so that we can now understand it. So I love in 8, 9, and 10 how we're getting ready for a priesthood, and then what happens is Aaron shows up and they gather all the assembly, which is all the people, to the tent of meeting. And this has happened before for God to give the instruction to the people, but this time God has Aaron bring all his sons, and he brings them out, and he gives them the instruction of ordination. And this instruction of ordination, I got to tell you, my ordination was like a 2.5-hour worship service. This is 7 days trusting that God's going to provide for you in the tent of meeting, right? But they stay there, and they present themselves, and they make themselves holy, and they do the things that they have to do to become a priesthood. They begin to wear the robes. They begin to get these like jewels of meeting and of understanding and discernment and wisdom. They have ritualistic symbols placed upon them so that the people can not only respect the office that they're receiving, but so that the people can see a glimmer of how they too should be living and acting. This priesthood that happens becomes powerful in not only the leading of the Israelite people, but in the example making so that others can have it. Now, church, I hope you heard that. I hope you got that a little bit. Because what it means for us today is that you and I have to pay attention to what we're doing. First, as a pastor myself, I read this section and it puts another level of awe and wonder on the depth of responsibility that I have to have as a leader, as a pastor, as a priesthood. I have to take it seriously. I might joke once in a while, and I'm willing to have somebody throw a lamb up on stage because I hope it got a decent chuckle. But it has to be more than that. It has to be something that you can see tangibly. But I also need it to transcend me and understand that it's not just me, that it points back to that promise in Exodus. And if I'm fulfilling my call, the call that Moses gave Aaron and his family, then what is happening is that we are elevating each other into that priesthood. And if we are elevating each other into that priesthood of all believers that was proclaimed in that salvation moment from Exodus, then what is happening is that all of us are taking up the mantle and the authority and the responsibility of helping people connect to the brokenness they experience and providing for them a tactile and tangible way through it. That's what Leviticus is doing over and over and over and over again. As the book moves forward, that pattern repeats itself over and over. God uses examples and metaphors to give us wisdom beyond just what we see in the religious service. There is Josephus, a first century rabbi, who, talking about the book of Leviticus, talked about the tent of meeting. And in the tent of meeting, when he was writing about it in his scholarly work, again, the first century, when he was writing about this particular understanding of the tent of meeting, what he said is that all the pieces of the tent of meeting were meant and specific by God to reflect a piece of the universe and to give us a connection to God in it. I tell you that because what I want you to know is that the book of Leviticus was trying to give people the ability to understand every aspect of their lives. And that's why it's so complex. That's why it's so hard. That's why we can't just take the verses that are in there at their surface level. At times we might gloss over them, but at other times we need to ask, what is the thing behind the thing? What is the thing that is really going on here? Why is God finding this to be important? And how does it translate to today, not just then? You see, after the priesthood is established and God's connection is made right through them, what happens is God gives them customs and forms and festivals and traditions so that they can deal with things that are going on. Often their festivals are around agricultural practices or seasonal relationship things. We still have many of those in our lives today. But then, after we get the rituals and the festivals, we move into a section, now that we have the priest, now that we have the festivals, that we deal with the you and me, the individuals, the people who are in the general audience of this. And these laws were governing how people had to be holy. Chapters 17 through 26 are about you and me. In fact, if you go to 17 through 26, especially 18 and 19, you get caught up with a bunch of stuff. You get at 19, 17 through 18, which says, you must not hate your fellow Israelites in your heart. Rebuke your fellow Israelites strongly so you don't become responsible for his sin. Right? It says that you can't hate somebody, but you also have to rebuke sin. There's a fine line to walk right there. You must not take revenge nor hold a grudge against any of your people. Instead, you must love your neighbor as yourself. Does that sound vaguely familiar? In chapter 19, verse 28, it says, do not cut your bodies for the dead or put markings on yourself. I am the Lord. Now, is that something that says you can't pierce your ears or get tattoos? For some people, it means yes. But if you look specifically, it says, do not cut your bodies for the dead. You have to understand what the culture around them was speaking about at that time. And at that time, some people would cut themselves and scar themselves or create tattoos for themselves of their dead so as to elevate their dead in their plane of existence. Basically, a ritual of elevating somebody into heaven, buying their way into the eternal, whatever that was for that culture or practice, or even elevating them to just below the status of a god. In that moment, it's idolatry. If you were to mark yourself, because the Israelites at times had marked themselves, had worn jewelry, had done things that were specific, but they were always to give glory and honor to God. You can't just read the surface. In 18:5, it says, you must keep my rules and my regulations. By doing them, one will live, for I am the Lord. What does it mean by one will live? What it means is that the duality of your brokenness is going to pass away. In Leviticus 19, verse 27, it says, you must not cut off the hair of your forehead or clip the ends of your beard. I don't know about you, but you've never seen me in a beard. I had a goatee for like a year, and it looked awful. I think I put some milk on it. The cat licked it off. It was that weak, right? But here, am I following God's commandment? As the guy that usually historically had a shaved head, this is like the longest my hair's been in probably 10 years. Was I following God's rules? Well, we need to understand why that was valuable and important. This text can't be taken lightly, but you can't also get trapped by it. For many of us, we'll spend so much time memorizing the purification culture of the Israelites that we'll become as the Sadducees and the Pharisees that Jesus railed against. We will become people if we spend so much time trying to live into the nuance of it that we will miss the why of it. Jesus spent a good deal of time trying to correct people in understanding that it had a deeper meaning, and you missed it. So when you read Leviticus, when I read Leviticus, what I want to challenge you to do is to spend time and ask, why is this important? What was it speaking to that I once read? Or what is it leading the people towards? And when you ask those questions, it will take a lifetime to understand all the things that happened in this book. The first time I preached on this book was about 12 years ago. And I would never write that sermon today because I've changed and my understanding has changed. But I read this book over and over again because I find a new wisdom in it about how I am to live my life with my God, how I am to prepare myself to be holy because God is holy, and how, in my living, I am called to elevate the priesthood of all believers. Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks and praise on this day for all the ways in which you meet us and you elevate your church and prepare your church to be those who proclaim the good news of your Son, Jesus, in whose name we pray.